Welcome to Global Connections with Robert Siegel, Navigating the New Normal, presented by the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Our monthly Leaders Forum addresses vital issues facing society and the economy, real estate and medicine, technology and science. My name is Dr. Joshua Plout. I'm the Executive Director of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, AFRMC, a 501c3 national American charitable organization based in New York City. We at AFRMC represent Israel's premier hospital, Rabin Medical Center, in Petah Tikva, in Greater Tel Aviv, the leading institution named in honor of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The hospital is a model of coexistence, as it serves 1 million patients annually from all ethnic and religious backgrounds with the same compassionate care. Please support our mission and this free public affairs program with a donation of any amount. Visit American Friends of Rabin Medical Center online and donate at afrmc.org. Join us on social media, on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, and our Facebook page and discussion group. We depend on our audience's support to help the hospital in Israel. So thank you if you can contribute any amount. Our host and moderator for Global Connections is Robert Siegel, former host of All Things Considered on National Public Radio for 31 years. Over the course of an hour each month, Global Connections features guests who Robert Siegel interviews as they explore important issues in our world. Today's Global Connections topic is Global Democracy in Crisis. Thank you to our very special guest, Professor Timothy Snyder of Yale University, and author of On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. Dr. Fiona Hill, Senior Fellow of Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution, and Dr. Aaron David Miller of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And now, Global Connections with Robert Siegel.
Thank you, Josh. When I was growing up, being American meant being a citizen of the world's most powerful, most influential democracy. We spoke of leading the free world. Country had its flaws for sure, but we had the right to criticize those flaws, to publish articles about them, to assemble and protest about them. Our allies in the world were mostly democratic, the most important ones. And the big one, big wartime ally that wasn't the Soviet Union was treated with a policy of containment to contain the spread of its power and its influence. When the Soviet Union fell apart, it seemed like democracy was getting more and more and more common throughout the world. Well, in recent decades, the democratic cause has been flagging. Several of the countries that threw off communist rule in the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe have become authoritarian states or illiberal democracies. Obviously, Russia under Vladimir Putin is the most glaring example. But also in the Middle East and North Africa, a wave of protests against entrenched dictators. The Arab Spring was crushed largely. Also from the Philippines to Brazil, tough guys won elections, but they did so promising to rule with an iron fist and sometimes to ignore the law. Why is it happening? Why is global democracy in crisis? And what, if anything, can be done about it? Well, we have a panel of 3 excellent guests. I'll interview each, and then we'll have about a half an hour of questions and discussion. You can take part in that part of the event by sending questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Our first panelist is Fiona Hill, Senior Fellow in Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. A native of the north of England, Dr. Hill was a coal miner's daughter. When the mines closed, her father found low-paying work in a local hospital. She experienced the kind of deindustrialization and communal impoverishment that we associate with Appalachian Ohio or West Virginia. She went on to earn a PhD at Harvard University in Russian history and was famously the National Security Council staffer in the Trump White House who testified at his first impeachment trial. Fiona Hill has written books about Vladimir Putin, about Russia's energy economy, and also most recently about her own life and career in a book called There's Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. Now, Fiona Hill, thank you very much for taking part in this discussion today. Good to see you. And first, a reality check. Is democracy globally challenged, in crisis?
Well, Robert, yes, unfortunately so. And, I'm obviously honored to be on with you and with the other panelists who've been writing about this themselves for quite some time. I think we can look for some examples where, in fact, we might see some positive strands. Most recently in Germany, for example, we've seen the formation of a new coalition government that actually ran on a rather unusual, at least the leading party, the Social Democrats in Germany, ran on what would seem a rather unusual platform of mutual respect in today's current climate. And, actually they themselves in forming a coalition of different parties, including the German Green Party, after a long period dominated by German Chancellor Angela Merkel and the Christian Democrats, are actually trying under rather challenging circumstances to show a different way forward of balancing out different political opinions and trying to tackle, in fact, some of the issues that may be at the root of all of this, of inequality and sensitive injustice. So, that's just one example of things where we could say, well, there's some efforts here. But overall, when we look at the picture, you said that yourself as you sketch things out. We've seen a lot of democratic backsliding in some countries that basically secured their independence after the end of the Cold War from the old Soviet bloc, Poland and Hungary, for example. This is an area that one of our panelists, Timothy Snyder, knows very well. I know that Professor Snyder has been spending quite a lot of time in Central Eastern Europe of late. We've seen some really challenges to the democratic developments that we thought in many respects, we were taking for granted there after the end of the Cold War. You mentioned yourself Russia at the very beginning. Russia was hardly the classic example of a democracy in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it was certainly a more pluralistic society. There was some competition of nascent political parties, not just the Communist Party of old, and that got turned around in 1999-2000 when Vladimir Putin came into power. In my native country of the United Kingdom, there's been an awful lot of challenges to democracy as well. We've seen more of a turn in populist politics and more of a resort to plebiscitary democracy in terms of referenda, one of which in 2016 on whether the United Kingdom should stay in the European Union or not, has been one of the most consequential, I would say, in recent British history, and was itself generated by arguments within one party, the Conservative Party of the United Kingdom, and really what was an inter-party dispute was thrown over to the public for a referendum, really kind of turning politics on its head. And of course, here in the United States, which globally people have been looking to as a kind of a bastion for democratic leadership, free and fair elections. We've seen all of the developments, not just during the Trump administration, but going back to January 6th and the storming of the Capitol building, which was in many respects kind of an expression of the efforts by former President Trump to stay in power. I, along with Professor Snyder and others, have called this a coup. Basically, Aaron and I'm sure David Miller will also have things to say about this. We're very disturbed by what's happening in the United States as well.
You wrote in your latest book that Russia is America's ghost of Christmas future. I want you to elaborate on that.
Yeah, well, that, of course, is taking liberties with Charles Dickens, kind of a staple of childhood growing up in the UK, as well as in the United States, but it was on our school curriculum. And I think I've said before, I actually recall writing a school essay about the ghost of Christmas future and what it stood for. So I've just kind of putting my, kind of grade, 6 or 7 paper. The spectral image of something that doesn't necessarily take form. Ebenezer Scrooge obviously woke up the next day and realized, what he was contending with, and he would have to change his ways. So, I was using this as a lesson here. And there's a couple of issues that I wanted to flag by using that image. First of all, in terms of Russia, it's the way that presidential politics have turned. I just referenced Vladimir Putin coming into power as the Russian president on the eve of the turn of the millennium, December 31st, 1999. Putin came in on a mandate of making Russia great again, turning around the humiliations and the state collapse of the 1990s, the humiliations being the loss of the Soviet Union and Russia losing in many respects a historic position of dominance in political and national security affairs in Europe. He wanted to basically strengthen also the Russian presidency after a period under Boris Yeltsin, in which not only did Yeltsin's ratings as a president fall to single digits, but the faith in the Russian presidency as an institution was also lost. He moved basically the presidency away from being part of a political party. He moved very quickly to stifle the activities of the Russian Duma, the Russian parliament. And essentially what we've got today in Russia is a presidency that has no checks and balances on it, which is upheld only by the constitution and by legitimacy from really what are plebiscites rather than full-fledged elections with very little opposition on the person of Vladimir Putin. He's also amended the constitution to stay in power potentially until 2036. And in the United States, under the Trump administration, which I was part of and saw this at close hand, we saw actually President Trump's efforts not just to stay in power beyond the 2020 election, which I'm sure we'll talk about in the panel, but also to, in a way, change the nature of the presidency. The US presidency has also always been something of a strange beast. It's directly elected. It's not selected by the party. I mean, that happens also in France, for example, and in Russia. But technically, President Trump is supposed to be part of the Republican Party, but in many respects, we've seen him usurp the party, overturn the party as a separate apparatus, talk about the party and membership being only contingent on being loyal to him. And also the presidency being the chief executive, the head of state, and the commander-in-chief as being, in his view, pulled away from the other institutional checks and balances around it. Attacks on the judiciary, for example, trying to sort of stack the Supreme Court and other court positions with people that he referred to as his judges. I mean, there are a whole host of developments that I'm sure we'll be talking about more here.
Let me take you back to Russia for a moment. As you acknowledge, the Russian experience of democracy was pretty brief. I mean, to the extent that Boris Yeltsin was a freely elected leader of the country. What do you say to the argument that there wasn't the socioeconomic stuff there? There wasn't the middle class, the history of independent organizations to support a democracy. It was ultimately authoritarianism was really in the cards for Russia. Could there just as easily have been a different course that Russia followed? Do you think that it could have been a true democracy by now had that happened?
Well, I think there are many things that could have happened there that might have put Russia on a different path. I mean, we also saw, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union itself, already the dissolution of the Soviet Union, in large part because Russia itself seceded under Boris Yeltsin from the Soviet Union, and Mikhail Gorbachev was trying to pluralize. So, what happened in Russia was coming on the back of Mikhail Gorbachev also trying to, expand the room for debate, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, transform the Communist Party and transform the Soviet Union and devolve more decision-making power. That didn't succeed for a variety of reasons. But then what we did see in the 1990s under Yeltsin, I mean, I think, getting back to your point about the economy did collapse as a result of the transition and a push for privatization. In part, that was a lot of misplaced assumptions about the nature of the Soviet system, the idea that if communism and the Communist Party and central planning were taken away, that Russia would, somehow immediately transform itself into a market economy, not factoring in the long history of Russia in which there was no experience of private property, the rule of law was rather weak. And those issues in themselves, the lack of a rule of law related to the private sector, commercial law, not just the larger laws of state, was also problematic. And the lack of experience in private property. And what you saw was an immediate consolidation of privatization of assets in the hands of oligarchs, what became oligarchs, but people who were closer to the state, so kind of a privatization in the hands of a small number of individuals, and not a lot of focus on the rule of law. in the kind of private sector, we ended up with crony capitalism and something of a kleptocracy. So I do think actually there could have been a different path, but we weren't factoring in, back in the early part of the 1990s, all the different components. And we didn't look at grassroots democracy. We did look at civil society, but really more in the kind of elite civil society, and didn't think about how to create grassroots political parties or really engage the citizenry as a whole.
Let me just put one more question to you, and unfairly, I'll ask you to be brief in answering it. How significant is the concept of democracy to the Russian-Ukrainian crisis that we're now watching?
Well, it's significant, but there's also a different element to this here. I mean, we talk about the fact that the Russians are worried about a democratic Ukraine showing, itself able to go on a different path. But one of the elements of this goes back to what I was just talking about oligarchs, kleptocracy, and crony capitalism. Because what the Russians are looking for in the case of Ukraine is to have a leadership there that they can manipulate. And the aspects of democracy, it's not so much the grassroots, the parties, some of the political issues we might talk about. It's the transparency and a different approach to governance, which is part of that as well. And what Russia wants to do is keep Ukraine close by being able to manipulate Ukraine's politics. And part of the trigger for the conflict is Russia seeing a different elite emerging in Ukraine, and Ukraine going on a different socioeconomic path as well. It's not just about democracy, it's about the nature of the Ukrainian leadership. And if Ukraine cleans up its act, there's less for Russia to be able to manipulate.
Fiona Hill, thanks. Stick with us for the question and answer session later, but thank you very much for your contribution so far and for being with us. Our next panelist is historian Timothy Snyder of Yale. Professor Snyder has written extensively on Eastern and Central Europe in the 20th century, and the 21st now. Among his many books are Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, Black Earth, The Holocaust as History and Warning, and more recently, On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. On Tyranny was originally published at the start of Donald Trump's presidency as a kind of warning against the potential frailty of American democracy. This year, Professor Snyder did something very interesting, publishing a new edition of the book, this time as a graphic novel. Tim Snyder, thank you very much for joining us today. I'll get to the graphic novel a little bit later, but first, if there is a global crisis for democracy, why now? What's happened? Is it that China has prospered enormously in a completely undemocratic model, and that changes values throughout the world? Is it the failure of democracies to live up to their challenges? Why? Why should we be talking about this now?
Okay, so number one, I want to build on a point that Fiona Hill was making. Mm-hmm. There's a misunderstanding that goes back about 30 years about what democracy consists of and how hard it is. So, I mean, a funny thing happened on the way to the end of history, basically. We spent 45 years in a Cold War in which we thought democracy was really uncertain and threatened at every moment, and that democracy depended upon ideas and fighting spirit and institutions. And then suddenly after 1989 or after 1991, we switched gears. Suddenly democracy was automatic. It was the state of nature. Capitalism was going to bring it. It didn't really require a whole lot of work. We were just going to coast. And so we basically undertook a kind of moral disarmament where we forgot everything that we knew, and we adopted a set of really stupid ideas, and then to a significant degree persuaded ourselves and also much of the rest of the world these ideas were true. So part of it is that the people who should have been on the side of democracy after 1989 kind of turned against themselves. And by those people, I mean us. The second thing I would say is that it's not really now, it's the last 20 years. And we've just taken a long time to figure out what's going on. And one of the reasons it's taken us a long time to figure out what's going on is that we're in such a habit of referring to ourselves as being democratic that we have a hard time taking in the evidence. And we got ourselves so convinced that there were these automatic forces, capitalism, that must push democracy forward, that we weren't really interpreting the evidence, even though it was right in front of us. So we're about 15 years behind in interpreting the evidence. So, I mean, I just want to undermine the premise of the question a little bit with the why now, because it's been going on for quite a while. In terms of the causes, the decadence and the complacency that I mentioned are also causes, but I would add to that, number one, social media. the internet became social media around the year 2010, and social media makes democracy extremely difficult because I mean, putting this very roughly, it shifts the basic focus of people's attention from a social reality to a social unreality. It gets people out of the habit of dealing with those with whom they disagree. It trains us basically like animals to be stimulated by the things that make us very pleased or very upset, which makes us unfit for normal kinds of civic engagement. Mm-hmm. That is incredibly important. And some of the things that then pop up in reality, or what, our Russian friends like to call the kinetic world, like, for example, this siege of Ottawa that's going on now, or like January 6th, those, in my view anyway, are more digital than they are real events. That is, the humans pop up at the end of the story, but the real story is actually cyber and invisible. A second major factor is inequality of wealth. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons why so-called populism and nationalism are so successful is that the populists and the nationalists have a point. They have a point about institutions. They have a point about, Mr. Trump had a point about the end of the American dream, right? If you're living in a country or in a world where a few families own as much as half the population, you have a problem. And people who are used to things going their way are suddenly finding out that things aren't going their way anymore. And they may misunderstand why. They may misdiagnose the problem as being immigrants or minorities or whatever, but there is actually a problem of inequality. And then the third factor you've already mentioned, which is that there are active important players, most importantly China and Russia, who are against democracy. They're against it in an interesting and new way. Unlike fascists or communists, they have no substitute for it. They have no ideas, right? In their recent joint statement, the best that Russia and China could do is to claim that we're the real Democrats because authoritarians rule most of the world, and therefore authoritarianism is actually really democracy, and democracy is really not democracy because it only governs the minority of the world, right? Which is a crazy argument, but it also points up the fact that they don't actually have anything to offer. Instead, all they do is try to eat up our ideas and criticize them from the inside, mock them, make them look absurd.
You mentioned the stupid ideas that gained currency in the 1990s. I want to put in a word here right now for our former ambassador to NATO, Ivo Dalder, who would have been with us, but for an immovable scheduling conflict that came up. And Ivo ran this thesis past me, which is very much what you're saying, that in the 90s, American thinkers were sucked in by ideas like the end of history and the unipolar moment, only one superpower in the world, and the benefits of a globalized economy. And they accepted a neoliberal consensus, the Washington consensus, as we say, which included, as Ivo, if he were here, would say, two critical falsehoods. One, that open economies or open trade yields open societies, which the Chinese have sort of disproven, and second, that a rising tide raises all boats, and as we've seen over the past 30 years, the tide has risen for the yachts a lot higher than it has for a lot of us in more modest craft, and the result has very often been the kind of oligarchy that Fiona Hill was talking about. Does that all sound about right to you?
Yeah, that sounds about right to me. I might push the point a little bit further and just add a little touch of irony to it, that we became determinists. So what was wrong with Marxism in the Leninist or Stalinist version was that it was determinist. Economics determined politics. We could see that was foolish. Of course, central planning wasn't going to automatically bring socialism. But then after 1989, we became determinists ourselves in a kind of Marxist way. Oh, capitalism has to bring democracy. That's required. There's some kind of automatic process. And of course, once you say that, you are lifting all responsibility from yourself. There's some larger outside force which is taking care of all of this for you, some invisible hand which is going to take care of political questions for you. So yeah, and the rising tide lifts all boats. I agree with Ivo's point, but I'm going to just swap out the metaphor for a different one. In the 1990s, we already knew about global warming. In 1988, President Bush said that he was going to use the White House effect to stop the greenhouse effect. We knew back then that it was a tremendous problem, but we convinced ourselves out of it, or with the help of a few well-moneyed corporations and lobbyists, we convinced ourselves out of global warming in the 1990s, and now we have a very different kind of rising tide. And whatever you think about it, or whatever people say they think about it, whether everybody believes in it, there are some people who pretend they don't, but whatever you say about it, global warming injects a tremendous amount of fear into politics generally. And I think that fear then takes different forms, and those forms can be exploited. So for example, in the US and the left, people are actually afraid of global warming. Many folks on the right are afraid of something else, which is some kind of demographic collapse. But I would argue that the fear in some sense is the same, that in the future we're not going to be around, there aren't going to be enough of us. And when you're very afraid of the future, it's hard to carry out democratic politics, because democratic politics kind of assumes that we're going to be around for iterations so we can make compromises. If there aren't going to be iterations, then it's harder to think about compromises.
Timothy Snyder, thank you very much, and hang around for about 10 minutes. We'll have our Q&A session. Rounding out our panel today is Aaron David Miller, who is Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. After earning his doctorate in Middle Eastern and American diplomacy at the University of Michigan, Aaron went on to practice what he'd been studying. At the State Department, he advised Secretaries of State George Shultz and James Baker, and he helped Baker plan the Madrid Mideast Peace Conference of 1991. A couple of years later, he became part of the U.S. team that tried for 7 years to mediate a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and he worked on that until the year 2000. In recent years, Aaron David Miller has been a widely sought commentator on U.S. foreign policy and other policies at both the Wilson Center and now at Carnegie. Aaron, thanks for taking part today in this. When I first asked you about democracy and the global challenge to it, you said you wanted to talk about America's glass house, so go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I again, and I wanted to express appreciation for being here with you and Fiona and Tim Snyder, and to the Rabin Medical Center, which is an extraordinary legacy to an extraordinary leader who is sorely missed for many different reasons. I wanted to bring the discussion back to the Republic and the relationship between our domestic dysfunction, democratic backsliding, and our credibility and reliability abroad. I mean, I've been around foreign policy for most of my professional life. Rarely have I seen the connection between our democratic dysfunction and backsliding and the way in which we're perceived abroad to be tighter and more destructive than it is now. And I say this recognizing that there is no end to history, and that 15 years after the Vietnam War, where people predicted the United States would no longer be able to assert its influence on the world stage, we were the only superpower, perhaps to our disadvantage. And I hear the same sort of talk in the wake of Afghanistan, which somehow is perceived as the fulcrum of Western civilization and the beginning of the collapse of the American Republic. However, as Tim and I think Fiona would acknowledge, we've never quite been where we are now today. And I just want to make three basic points about the dangers with respect to our foreign policy. Number one is, yeah, America is back. And the Biden administration has made it unmistakably clear and has done many things. I would argue they've picked a lot of low-hanging fruit, but it was important to reassert American participation in organizations that its predecessor not only decried, but left. But the real question is, America's back for how long? The view in Europe certainly is that the 2022 midterms, if the past is any guide to the future, could produce on average, if history is a guide here, an average loss by the incumbents party of 25 seats in the House and the Senate. And then there's talk about the toggling back from a Democratic administration to perhaps a second Trump administration, Grover Cleveland, bite your tongue, or perhaps another Republican president who may not be Trump, but who may embody many of the characteristics which I would have argued undermine both our unity at home and our credibility abroad. And that is a serious concern. The second issue is what I call the great undoing. I've been in transitions over the course of 25 years through a half a dozen administrations, from D's to D's, D's to R's, R's to D's, and R's to R's. But never in my experience have I seen an administration that is Biden's predecessor, Trump administration, fundamentally undo so much of what mainstream Republican and Democratic administrations have done in the past. We have what I call, I think I'm borrowing this phrase from someone, not just partisanship, but a pernicious partisanship, which makes consensus on foreign policy, certainly at the congressional level, very difficult. The notion that we could actually ratify a treaty that might be tethered to the American national interest, I think for the foreseeable future has gone the way of the dodo. Finally, the glass house problem. You know, there's a wonderful line from Shakespeare, Henry IV. Jack Kennedy loved this line, and I can see why. One character says to the other, you know, I can summon the spirits from the vasty deep. And the other replies, but so can any man. The question is, do they come when you call? Kennedy loved that line, and it's understandable why. We live in a glass house. I was never a champion of lecturing the world about the virtues of American democracy, but I believed in perhaps the only democratic polity founded on the basis of an idea, however imperfect. I think it's extremely difficult now to moralize and pontificate to the world, given our own domestic dysfunction. I think it was brought home to some degree in the Democracy Summit that the administration held at the end of last year. It was a conglomeration of flawed and imperfect democracies led by, at the moment, and I think the Economist Intelligence Unit's survey is out, I think embargoed until 7 o'clock tonight. But the US is in the flawed democracy category. I think number 26 out of 167 countries. It didn't even make the full democracy category for obvious reasons. The only value, I think, to conclude in the dysfunction that has beset the Republic, and Tim is right to say that this is not just a function of an administration. It's been ongoing for at least 2 decades, is perhaps the remedial focus on what ails us at home. We have a broken house. It has to be fixed. The Cold War is over. And I think, you know, Lincoln summed it up best in a quote from his 1838 speech when the then ex-congressman was philosophizing about the future of the Republic. I'm sure Fiona and Tim know this quote well, and perhaps Robert, you do as well. Lincoln goes on to talk about how no external power would ever take a drink out of the Ohio or track the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. And then he says, at what point does danger come? If it ever reach us, it must spring amongst us, he says. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. I'm sorry that we are where we are now, but perhaps it's the beginning, not the end, I hope, of the American experiment, democratic experiment.
Well, let me put an example from the Middle East to you, and I want you to wrestle a little bit with the problem it poses about democracy, and that was Egypt, where there were protests that ousted an entrenched leader who, and I confess, I feel guilty as a journalist that we never referred to that leader as a dictator when he was in power, but we did very often after he was ousted. We referred to him, to Hosni Mubarak, as having been a dictator. The Egyptians got a freely elected president whose agenda immediately seemed to include starting a war with Ethiopia over water, inviting the people who had planned the assassination of President Anwar Sadat to presidential events, to the horror of Egyptian generals. And there was a coup and he was replaced. Would we be better with a freely elected President Morsi of Egypt, as he was, than we are with an authoritarian, technically elected, but in the kind of system that guarantees a victory, elected president of Egypt?
Well, Morsi had his 18-month run, and
Yeah.
I would argue it wasn't terribly productive. I mean, I am
I think
not
that's an understatement, yes.
I'm not a determinist, and I think Tim is right here. We are far too bound up with the inexorability or inevitability of the success of the American experiment. We take it way too much for granted. I put myself at the top of the list. But look, Tacitus argued in the 1st century that the best day after the death of a bad emperor was always the first day. The Arab Spring came. It was a heroic effort by Arabs, young and old, to reclaim their political space, to create openings for free expressions and freedom of conscience. But it was poorly organized, highly divided, and it faced disciplined and reactionary elites, particularly in the military. And you saw it everywhere. The Assads are still in power in Syria. Mm-hmm. Yemen is now a divided battleground. The only democratic polity that emerged from the Arab Spring with any hope and promise was Tunisia. And now that's led by a emerging authoritarian who prefers order and discipline over free expression. So I can't speak for others. I can speak for us, however. And I think reinserting the value proposition into American foreign policy. We were on a values holiday for the last 4 years under the Trump administration. At least reasserting the values proposition in our foreign policy is critically important to our own learning experience and our own self-reflection on the failings of our democracy. And I must say the Biden administration has made an effort here, but we are dealing from one end of the region to the other with either adversarial or acquiescent authoritarians. And I think that's unfortunately a Middle East reality that the United States is not going to be able to change.
Aaron David Miller, thank you. And thank you for offering something prescriptive here that could be done about this. I'd like to bring back Tim Snyder and Fiona Hill and ask all of you, we'll start with you, Fiona. What are some things that the U.S. can do that might bolster democracy in the world or counter the trends that we've been talking about?
Look, I think there are several things that we can do that start at home in terms of getting our own act together and showing that, contrary to what Aaron has said about, the glass house, that we can actually make something more robust. And it can't be just done from the top. I mean, I think this gets to the heart of what both Aaron and Tim have been saying, particularly when we look at the issues of inequality, injustice, and unfairness. I mean, that was actually the theme of my my recent book, written from my own perspective. Of someone who certainly experienced in the period after the 1980s with massive deindustrialization in the north of England that also ultimately affected Soviet Union, Russia, most of Europe and the United States at different points, where you get people feeling not just dislocated when they lose their work and they lose their sort of sense of identity, but also disrespected, by elites who move ever further away from them. And all feel that they have, little that they can do about this. And, the populist politics plays into that, as Tim was already starting to lay out. And feeding off the grievances and frustrations of people who feel left behind or left out, or that they don't see themselves as part of something. And one of the major issues that we see in all of these societies is a kind of people feeling disconnected from representatives. I mean, what is the reason for right now here in the United States that we're seeing a sudden upsurge in desires for new unions to be formed? And everything from where I work at the Brookings Institution with our research assistants to your local Starbucks to Amazon warehouses, people feel that their voice aren't being heard in the workplace. Because work has started to, take on an identity. That sounds a little deterministic because, of course, Marx would have also said that people's identity and culture was also, tied to the workplace. But in reality, you see that, the immediate networks that people are part of form their identity. And, in the United States, like in other places, a lot of that comes from work or, other communities that you're part of. And people want to have a voice and want to be represented. And we obsess so much in normal programs of democratization. When I was working at Harvard in the Kennedy School, I was part of something called the Strengthening Democratic Institutions Project for many years, which was looking at the way in which we could help the former Soviet Union, Russia in particular, transition away from centrally planned authoritarian system to, more democratic pluralism. We focus continuously on the mechanics of creating political parties and on elections, and on, what Russians later became to talk about the political technologies. We didn't talk about grassroots efforts. We didn't talk about how parties should be bottom up. Everything was top down. This is basically what Aaron was talking about in the Middle East, where everything is top down. You had, the Arab Spring and the grassroots upsurge that couldn't find any kind of leadership and didn't find a voice. And I think, here in the United States, what we're trying to do now, we fixate on who's going to be in the White House, what the political parties are doing. And at the same time, we see at the grassroots level a great desire for more kinds of representation, more kind of a voice in issues. If we can bring that together, it gets back into the stuff of, the work of, other people like Bob Putnam, for example, in the work that he's done about, bowling alone, and his recent book on the upswing about, talk in which there can be more participation. Different groups at different levels of society. If we can reinvigorate that and sort of mobilize, that I think we can show a different lesson to the outside world. People are looking to the United States right now as a signal of whether, it's kind of hopeless for putting things together. So I think starting at home, there's some, real prescriptions, things that we can do. We can all mobilize ourselves in terms of thinking about what role we can play in society as a whole, figuring out how to, in our own communities and networks, give a greater voice to people and, to come up with concrete responses.
Timothy Snyder, you have actually you've published a guidebook on how to avoid loss of democracy on tyranny. Actually, back in 2017, when it came out, I asked you if you had been intending to write for a younger readership than your typical. You would only grant me slightly younger, but coming out with it as a graphic novel, which is very, it's actually quite interesting and a very not just compelling, but now charming piece of work. Clearly, that's part of an effort to connect with people on some level. That this is important. That this is an important subject for us to be acting on. Is that correct?
Of course. I mean, democracy is all about communication. When I wrote on tyranny, I was trying to drop, the pretense that I had important things to say to everyone else. On tyranny is basically written in the words of others. It's written in the words of people from whom I've learned, dead and alive. It's written in the words of Polish dissidents and Czechoslovak oppositionists and German Jews who lived through the Holocaust and Ukrainians on the Maidan. It's all me borrowing ideas from other people and trying to show their general significance for an American audience. And so, many of the ideas in On Tyranny are about the sorts of things that Fiona was just mentioning. Of the 20 lessons, the one that I may get asked about the most is make eye contact. One of the lessons is make eye contact in small talk. And so, and that's, in a way, it's meant to be encouraging, because I'm suggesting that little things about our daily practice actually matter a great deal. That it's not trivial that someone who's feeling oppressed, perhaps rightly, feels your eye contact as opposed to feeling that you're looking away, right? We know from history that matters. So on tyranny is about high politics, but it's about the kind of daily life of high politics, and it reaches something that I think both you and Fiona were hinting at, and I want to say it out loud, maybe in a slightly different way. If you drop, if you move out of the glass house and you drop the pretension that you're better than everybody else, there's also a positive side to that. I mean, it's kind of a relief. I mean, I find it a relief to be able to talk to my Russian and Ukrainian friends and compare notes about how things go wrong. I find it very productive, as Fiona does, to look at Russia as an example of where we might be going. If you get off your high horse or your pedestal, or whatever metaphor we want to use, and accept that democracy is really hard and we're all having a difficult time with it, and we can all learn from one another. That's also a warm place. Like, that's a warm feeling. That's a sense, okay, like we've messed things up. We can learn from other people, and other people maybe can learn from us once we get our house in order. And here I just couldn't agree more with what Fiona has said, and also with what Aaron has also suggested. We can't really be a beacon for a world if the light's out, and currently the light is out. We have to find a way to rekindle that light ourselves. And that has to do with all kinds of technical American things like gerrymandering and dark money and the electoral college. And I would add social media. These are all things that we have to fix before we can be persuasive to other people and be an example for other people.
I can't resist remarking when you speak about eye contact, that on one of these panels several months ago, Sherry Turkle, who's in addition to being an MIT professor, is also a psychotherapist, mentioned that one of the oddities of the Zoom era is that in order to create the illusion of eye contact with the patient, one must avoid eye contact, that is, not have eye contact with the image of the person on the screen, but rather look at the point that will create the illusion of eye contact. So we may be living in a time when eye contact is at its most difficult. Aaron, more thoughts about what we should be doing?
I mean, I'd offer three. I mean, again, this is on the individual level, but I think that's incredibly important because every individual is a universe of possibilities. Number one, and I realize I'm talking to two academics, study history. History teaches humility, and whatever Mark Twain meant by history rhymes, looking at the rhythmic patterns of the past are really, really important. Because if you don't know where you've been, you really are never going to divine or have any chance of figuring out where you're going. Second is the notion that without leaving your house, you have access to more information, a diversity and richness of opinion, information than at any other time in the entirety of the human experience. And yet we've grown lazy. We've contracted out our politics to talking heads. The way we look at our news to media organizations without doing the work ourselves. When Jack Kennedy gave his famous speech on October 22nd, on the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the three networks went back to normal programming immediately. What do you know what that meant? That meant my parents, and I'm sure I was 12 at the time, I didn't watch, had to listen to what Jack Kennedy had to say and figure out on their own what he was saying at a time of mortal danger to the country. We've lost that. And finally, when you are engaged in conversation with someone with whom you fundamentally disagree, instead of using the time while your interlocutor is speaking to figure out the talking points that you're going to use to rebut he or she, listen, because you may well discover that there are useful ideas, not just to advance your own arguments, but maybe in fact, to build a common bridge that could get the two of you somewhere to a better place.
I have some questions that have come, and this is from an anonymous viewer, and I guess I'll give it first to Aaron, but then whoever else wants to say. Please evaluate the health and future of Israeli democracy, and will other democracies ever be born in the Middle East?
I mean, I would only say that on June 13th, after a decade of extraordinary tumult, political division, assault on the judiciary and the independent press, there was a normal transition of power from the Netanyahu government to the Bennett government. I mean, a normal transition of power. And that's stunning to me in a society that in many respects confronts internal as well as external problems, huge ones. The Israelis managed to do what we couldn't. We got there in the end, but the broken confidence and the trauma has left a legacy that's going to haunt this nation for some time to come. I mean, Israel has many different problems. I got into a huge argument with my daughter, Jennifer, in Jerusalem She was arguing that Israel was a preferential democracy. It was not a democracy for all of its citizens, a preferential democracy. And the 2 million Palestinian citizens of Israel who do suffer economic and social discrimination, but who are citizens of the state and most want the social and economic benefits and the kind of equality that the Israeli Declaration of Independence guarantees them. Yeah. It's a problem. Young democracies have these problems. Last point, if you looked at us in 1846, roughly 70 years after independence, what would you have seen?
A low bar there, Aaron, but I'll accept that in the interest of getting on to another question. This one from Shira Goldman. It's nothing new, she writes, that politicians and media figures are interested in their own careers or advancement or power. However, I find the naked self-interest and disregard for truth and the good of the country somehow new and particularly chilling. And she cites Trump and Tucker Carlson as et cetera, et cetera. Is there a way, Tim Snyder, is there a way to get beyond this, given how rewarded these impulses have been? As Trump won doing this, Tucker Carlson is the most popular character on cable news.
So I think there was a French philosopher, Jewish origin, someone who I admire quite a lot, called Simone Weil. Mm-hmm. And one of her brilliant, concise observations was that fiction is costless and factuality is expensive. And that's simply true. And so if we imagine that the market or just the way things are is going to magically bring us the facts that we need to carry out a civic and political conversation, we are terribly, terribly mistaken. In order to have democracy, you have to have factuality. People have to know the basic things about their lives. You have to know whether your local politicians are corrupt. You have to know whether your water is polluted. You have to know these basic things. And it's a striking feature of the world, not just the United States, but also of many countries where democracy is in decline or has fallen. Russia was actually a good example of this, that local news goes first. So in the United States, now most counties are technically news deserts in the sense that there is no reporter, right? So in order to scratch our way back towards a world where what Tucker Carlson says or what Donald Trump says don't dominate, we have to do a couple of things. The first is we have to recognize in principle that not just opinion matters, but that factuality matters, and we can't do without it. We can't have the rule of law without it. We can't have conversations without it. We can't have policy without it. We can't have anything without it. And it's normal to have different values, but if we have different facts, we can't be a civil society at all. And then the second thing we have to do is we have to produce facts. We have to tax social media as though we're producing an externality, which it is. It's polluting our politics with fiction. We have to tax it and use the money in some way to support local journalism so that someone produces the facts again. So the problem, in my view, is not the particular people, much as I write about them like everyone else does, but the answer, the solution has to be systemic. It has to involve the value of factuality and the institutions that can produce factuality, and also the institutions which are making factuality much harder. Social media runs on fiction. In the 2020 election, as in 2016, we might have been luckier in 2020, but Facebook was delivering to us fiction after fiction after fiction. The Christian sites and the African-American sites on Facebook that people most looked at were created by trolls in the Balkans, right? Something is basically wrong there, which just condemning individual liars isn't going to fix.
And while I didn't know of the Simone Weil origin of the quotation that you cited, I do recall a BBC news executive once telling me of his struggles for the budget, that opinions are free, but facts, the stuff of the news division, were expensive. And in fact, it's a lot easier it's a lot less expensive for us to sit around and talk about things that other people have reported and corroborated than it is to actually go out and do the reporting and the corroboration.
Yeah, expensive but priceless. You can't do without it.
Fiona Hill, thoughts on dealing with the new alternative fact universe that we've been thrust into?
Well, I was almost applauding and standing up when Tim, made those last series of comments, because I couldn't agree more. I mean, 7,000 local newspapers have disappeared in the United States over the last 10 to 15 years, basically pushed out because they couldn't keep up with advertising revenue. I mean, it's along the same lines that Tim says. I mean, obviously, the budgets of your old institution, National Public Radio, and also PBS and public service television have also been slashed. And in fact, they've become, the purview of the likes of us, all of the people who understand that facts are expensive and, we're willing to support and also to listen. Where, when you're out on cable networks and, Sirius, news and, channels on FM, this is all kind of free because it's paid for by someone else. So the biggest problem is most of the news that we consume is paid for by someone else. It's the news that we are being fed rather than the news that, perhaps it's that we could use the most. And I think that this tax idea is spot on. I will just say that I've done this myself. I basically early on, when I thought Facebook was a great way to network with my family members and keep track of my relatives in Australia, my husband and I actually invested in some Facebook stock. We have now put this into a charitable fund to give away. And I think about this as, in fact, a democracy tax. I can't stand, now, the whole way that social media has distorted not just, the public life, but our personal lives. I mean, some of the rubbish that my relatives sent me, I feel like I have to block as well. So we have to think like a sugar tax, a carbon tax, all of the other ways in which this is a democracy tax. I'm sure it'll be, unpopular in some circles, but we also see a moment right now of bipartisan support, particularly after we had, the whistleblower on Capitol Hill talking about, the algorithms. Now, those algorithms, of course, reflect our own lives. That is artificial intelligence, which, those are programmed by people, reflecting their own biases and their own views of the way the world works, which is in which basically extreme views, dramatic events, often if they're fabricated, fictionalized, as Tim is suggesting, are obviously more of interest than sometimes the mundane facts, objective facts of an issue. But news and objective facts ought to be like the weather. Yes, there was a moment where the former president tried to draw a different path heading towards Alabama and the hurricane, which we all remember. But kind of when you need actually a warning of the weather, it is actually usually useful to get the correct information for a tornado or a hurricane warning. I think we need to approach facts in the same way. There needs to be in a public good. There's a big debate in the United Kingdom right now about how to fund the BBC. It's somewhat arcane now to fund it through a license for a television set when most people are watching the news on a handheld device. But we do have to think of some kind of public subscription, as Tim is suggesting. And I think that the more of us that want to move away, in the interests of getting facts, I certainly want facts, but they're behind paywalls and subscriptions. We have to be able to make that, available for everyone now. So I think we have to put our thinking caps on, but as Tim is suggesting, something along the lines of a tax and information, in the interests of objective information is maybe essential.
I would just, by the way, add one footnote to your remark about my former work home for decades, NPR, that the shift that's taken place in public radio is from the program that is on at the same time for everyone to listen to together, a sort of a communal civic act at some level, to the podcast that's built around the convenience of your own schedule and your preference for what you'd like to listen to. So it's not as big a change as it was when we stopped having 30 million people watch Walter Cronkite at once to what's happened there. But there is a shift away from the common experience of the news broadcast to the individual experience. We may not have enough time for this when we're edited, but I'm going to ask you one other question for all of you. There's a new book coming out soon by two political scientists, Guriev and Treisman, whom I really don't know, but it's called Spin Dictators. And it's about a new kind of dictatorship, they say, in which the authoritarian leader doesn't necessarily do what Xi Jinping might be doing in Xinjiang province to Uyghurs or poisoning political rivals, but they control information. They maintain, it's legal to have an opposition party, but that party, given economic and legal realities, is almost certain to lose all the time. they don't, unlike fascists and Stalinists, who I think disdained democracy and publicly said it didn't work, it wasn't effective. They call themselves Democrats. I wonder whether any of you sort of find some resonance with that idea that we have a new kind of authoritarian leader around, some of whom they include, Hungary's president, but also Singapore, they would declare being led by they would say a spin dictator. I'm just curious whether, Aaron, do you?
Oh, the so-called, I think it's already here, the so-called liberal democracy.
Yeah.
Where in fact leaders manipulate the trappings of the democratic enterprise and seek to control. I mean, I don't want to retreat into some cocoon and believe that somehow, and Tim's right, unless we work at it, our democracy is going to be fundamentally threatened. There's so many rabbit holes down which the republic can go. Civil war, coups, liberal democracies, that I'm beginning to fear that whatever course we take, we're going to essentially be departing from that experiment into a new kind of experiment. And I think the spin doctor, the spin authoritarian is as compelling a model as any.
We're out of time. Thank you to all of our guests, to Aaron David Miller and to Timothy Snyder and to Fiona Hill. Thanks so much for sharing an hour with us. And many thanks to Joshua Plout, Nate Bonzani, Roni Giuliano, and Sarah Lipoff of the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, and also to our technical director, Sam Lanetta. Our program sponsor is the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. It's a 501c3 national charitable organization. It represents in the US, Israel's largest hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv. The website for the organization is www.afrmc.org. Join us next month for the Biden Economy and Business Outlook with guests Professor Jason Furman, Abby Joseph Cohen, and John Cassidy, economics writer for The New Yorker. And after that, we'll explore extreme weather trends, the rising tide. I'm Robert Siegel. This has been Global Connections, Navigating the New Normal. See you next month. Stay healthy and stay safe.